My name is Maxwell Grant. I am a math major in CAS, and I'm also following the pre-medical track. So for my senior thesis, I decided to combine the two and talk about mathematics in medicine, forecasting the spread of influenza via a time series model. And before I start, I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Gangopadhyay, in the back from the Math and Stats Department. So just a little background on where my research sort of came from. So mathematics and medicine, it might seem like two completely different fields, but really the use of mathematics in medicine is nothing new. We can talk about numerous types of mathematical research within the medical field, but specifically the work I was doing looked to develop a mathematical model that accurately forecasts the number of people who will become infected by a particular disease over a particular period of time or in a particular cycle of that disease. In a second, I'm going to talk about some of the previous research that was done, why some of that previous research is inadequate, and why the models I created might be similar to those models or even better in the future. So if we look at some of this previous research, a lot of previous research in this field has been in the field of dynamical systems or differential equations or statistical models. So if we look at dynamical systems or differential equations, a lot of times the idea behind these models is that they forecast or they predict change over time, which we would think might be a good way to model the spread of disease. Unfortunately, these equations, or I should say these models, use very large, complex, and computationally challenging methods. They require a large number of variables and parameters. They're really not accessible to physicians who don't have a complex or a very broad background in the mathematical field. And additionally, the addition of these large numbers and variables and parameters can actually make the model look better than it actually is. It can kind of give you a false sense of accuracy in sort of the accuracy measures that go along with these models. Other models in place, some statistical models that we look at, one specifically was what's called cyclic regression. So cyclic regression is basically just adding a sine and cosine term to a linear regression model. So it basically just looks like sort of like a snake graph is the best way to show it, like a very cyclic curve. If we look at the spread of influenza and other diseases, they have a very cyclic pattern, so these models might be a good choice. A lot of the times they are, but unfortunately they don't take into account the random variability that occurs from year to year. And basically what that means is they're making the same predictions every year. And if the spread of influenza was the same every year, there'd be no reason to model it because we know exactly what's going to happen. So those are just some of the models that are in the literature right now. And so the direction my project took was to use what's called a time series to forecast future infection numbers. For those of you who might not have as large of a mathematical background, a time series is basically just a series of points plotted over a time interval equally spaced between each other. You can sort of think of it as a line graph. It's not really going to look like a line when you plot it, which I'll show you in just a couple seconds, but it's generally just going to look like a bunch of points spaced out evenly over time, plotting, again, something over time, which is really the easiest way to describe it. And just as a side note, we used influenza as the study for this disease, and we could have used a multitude of diseases that occur every year around the world. Influenza was used because it's a very cyclic pattern. We know it's going to happen every year. You hear it in the news and media all the time. There's going to be a giant influenza outbreak. It's the worst influenza outbreak we've had in X number of years. Every winter we hear that, right? So this past winter again. So the reason we use this disease is because we know it's going to happen, and we know about what time of the year it's going to happen. It's probably going to peak in January, February. We can predict that pretty accurately. The only thing that we don't know on a year-to-year basis is how many people are going to get sick and how bad the outbreak is actually going to be. And so using the time series model, we were looking to be able to forecast how bad the outbreak actually is going to be. And so the methods we took when we were, or I should say the methods we did when we were looking at this project was we collected 15 years of data, or over 15 years of data, from the French Sentinel Network, which is a group in France that collects data on the spread of disease and how many people get sick per week. We also collected 5 years of data from the United States to build a separate model. The reason that we were only able to collect 5 years of weekly reports from the United States was because the CDC produced inconsistent reporting methods before 5 years ago. So only within the last 5 years have they broken it down where you can extract the data and actually do an analysis of it. So we took that data, we plotted it in a programming program called RStudio, And then once a time series was plotted, what we did was we cut off the last 10% of data points. And then we used one of these forecasting methods in RStudio to then predict the final 10% of points. And then once we had our predictions, we were able to compute the error between the observed data points and our forecasted data points. So if we just take a look at the couple of plots, so this is the initial time series that was plotted in RStudio from the French network. All right, so what we see is we plot the number of cases per week on a 15-year basis. Okay, we're seeing a range from basically 0 in the summer to upwards of a million cases a week in the peak of the season. And then here are our forecast plots. So what we did was we took 3 forecasting models in RStudio. So one's called an ARIMA model, one is called a BATS model, and one is called a Holt-Winters model. And so what we did was, after going through a little programming language jargon, we were able to predict the blue line, which is the predicted number of, or I should say the forecasted number of cases that are going to occur in time. And so really what we see here is that a lot of these, or I should say all 3 of these models carry the pattern, is really the best way to say it. So in other words, they continue the cyclic pattern that we saw from the previous 10 or 15 years and continue it onwards. And so the results that we got from this were that we were able to forecast these future influenza numbers through modeling in RStudio with accuracy of up to 96% with one of the models. Now, each model definitely had its benefits and its drawbacks. Some models were better equipped for predicting the sort of random variability that occurs each season. Some were better suited at forecasting what we knew was going to happen each season, sort of the seasonal component of the data. We did identify one model that seems to be better than the others, which was, if we go back one slide, which was this ARIMA model in the top left corner. And so finally, what we were able to do is we were able to look at specific strains of influenza, strains A and B, which occur in the United States. And we were able to take that ARIMA model, the one we determined as the most accurate, and also forecast the spread of strains A and B into the future. Now, it was expected that this would happen for strain A because strain A makes up the majority of cases within the US and makes up the majority of the points you saw on those graphs that I put up. Having a relatively accurate forecast for strain B was a little more surprising because that can be a lot more variable from year to year. You have much fewer infection numbers from year to year. So the fact that we were able to develop a somewhat accurate model based on that data was fairly surprising. And so in conclusion, so we hope that this research can be continued to incorporate other forecasting methods within the Studio package. We looked at 3 of potentially 30+ models that are within the forecast package that could potentially be used to predict these data points. So we hope that in the future, someone will be able to look at these other models and see if the accuracy matches what we found. We also hope that these types of models can make this information more accessible to physicians and to people who work in the healthcare field who might not have as strong a mathematical background. I mean, if we look at examples like the differential equations that I was talking about earlier, you see these highly complex models that, quite frankly, I don't understand as a math major sometimes. And finally, we hope that these models, again, can one day be used to predict outbreaks before they occur, maybe help with the development of vaccines based on the spread of strains, and finally, hopefully help healthcare workers prepare for epidemics in the future. So with that, that's about all I have to say today, so I'll open the floor for a couple questions if we have time. Chloe.
What was the most difficult part of this process?
Learning to code. Anybody who knows me when I took computer science knows that learning to code is the bane of my life. Mike and David know who they are. Sam.
From a policy standpoint, do you see some application for models of this nature to be used to drive down like healthcare costs or vaccination costs or research costs, like in these situations with influenza or other kinds of outbreaks?
I hadn't really thought of it. That's a good question. It's certainly possible if we could, if we know, or if we have a general idea ahead of time of what's going to happen in future years. Potentially, we could save some costs there, or set some money aside and sort of distribute the money as might be necessary. But that's a good question. I haven't thought of that. I think one more question. Okay, Nicole.
Could your model potentially incorporate things like vaccination rates or the virulence of a given strain of the flu, or is it strictly based off of trends from data from previous years?
It could potentially be based on, we could take vaccination rates into account. I think the only reason we didn't was just for time,
Right.
for time's sake.
To like play around with adding in different parameters, you could.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You certainly could. I think one more. Okay, Monica.
So you got your data from the French census, you were saying, right?
Mhm.
Did you look at like areas with different population densities and like how that modeling like the spread of like cities versus like smaller towns and stuff like that?
No, good question. Unfortunately, they didn't report that in that much detail. Unfortunately, the network really, it's just basically a group of doctors who just report the number of cases they see per week, and it's really not broken down by region. And that kind of holds true for everywhere. All right. Well, thank you, folks. Have a good one.